Hello, strangers, to borrow an allusion to the song title of the jukebox track that Kevin uses to romance Chiron/Black in the final act of Moonlight. That's a lengthy way of saying hello, everybody, and welcome to today's class. What I thought I would do is go over in somewhat painstaking detail the Žižek reading in the hopes of really making sure that all of the nuances are understood, because I think there's a lot more perhaps going on here than a superficial reading might offer. And that, of course, is also in some ways Žižek's main argument, is not to be superficial, but to rather plumb the depths of our society and the world we live in. So let's go through it together, and then I'll end with some comments about Moonlight. So looking at the Žižek piece, I think the first thing that is important to recognize is, well, obviously stylistically you can see that he's a bit of a jokester, somewhat, some people call him cynical or snarky, even sarcastic in some ways. He does use a lot of anecdotes and jokes to kind of get his point across. And I think that there's a way that does set up a certain tone and mood for the reading. But looking at page 1, I think that the aspect that I really want us to not lose sight of is a sentence that might otherwise go under the radar. It's the middle paragraph, where at the end of that paragraph he says that taking a step back enables us to identify a violence that sustains our very efforts to fight violence and to promote tolerance. So he's going so far as to say that in many ways objective violence is not only just this otherwise seemingly invisible violence that's happening during a neutral, seemingly non-violent situation, but he's actually arguing that it is objective violence that in some ways kind of compels us to focus on subjective violence and to be these humanitarians that he criticizes throughout the piece, who are constantly looking to try to take urgent action to fix violent problems. So again, I want you to notice the relationship in some ways between objective and subjective violence. Not just that they're different, but that one in some ways tends to push us in a particular direction to be focused on the other. Moving on, onto page 2, I think the key line that I think always helps me to really grapple with this idea of objective violence is right smack dab in the middle of the page, where he states that it is the violence that sustains the very zero-level standard against which we perceive something as subjectively violent. Again, the idea that for there to be subjective violence, for there to be something that we in our everyday lives consider to be violence and recognize as violence, there has to be this supposedly neutral background, this supposedly normal, peaceful state of affairs, upon which then this sudden act of subjective violence catches our attention. And what Žižek is pointing out here is that objective violence is precisely all of the violence that's happening in that supposedly normal, peaceful state of affairs. Think about things like the capitalist economy and its exploitation of workers. Think about the ways that racism is operating on an institutional level, not just on the interpersonal level. All of those kinds of things. Think about patriarchy and the way that operates on an everyday level, oftentimes in a way that seems somewhat hidden even. Those are the things that he's talking about when he's mentioning this zero-level standard. And then he goes into discussing this idea of how we as a society rank various catastrophes. I think that's a very interesting conversation, particularly with regard to COVID-19, because you might say, well, COVID-19 is obviously, right, this is incredibly disruptive and deadly and tragic and all of that. And yet if you think about it, the Time magazine cover story that he refers to mentions that 4 million people died in 1 decade in Congo, a country in Africa. And you have to think about, like, why is it that we don't consider 4 million lives lost on the African continent to be even remotely close to how top of mind for example, COVID-19 is for all of us. It's just, he's pointing out just the way that we do as a society, and media often really reinforces this, seemingly makes certain tragedies very visible, certain forms of violence very visible, and others kind of recede into the background. Moving on to page 4, what he basically says here is that, again, there is this way that subjective violence seduces us. It almost kind of, as he puts it, it lures us into focusing on it, and that really prevents us from having a more global, more penetrative analysis of what's going on in the society that we live in the otherwise normal state of affairs. And this is where he launches into this idea of the importance of dispassionate analysis. What he says, I think, towards the bottom of page 4 that I really like, is that this kind of dispassionate, really, really analytical, critical lens is not only just theoretically, in his mind, appropriate, but he states that it is actually what we need to do out of respect towards the victims of not only objective but subjective violence. That, in other words, taking this kind of really critical, more a perspective that goes under the surface to really analyze our society and how it functions, that's required to actually give restitution to those who do end up suffering subjective forms of violence. I think that's an important point to keep in mind. And then he talks about poetry, and I think this is really important to think about, this set of passages in his text in reference to Moonlight, right? Moonlight is, if nothing else, a deeply poetic film. As you probably know from having just watched it, there are so many moments in the film that are so different from your average kind of action film or even any other kind of genre film, where there's constantly this need to move the plot forward, and there's just this constant sort of sense of the narrative as a train that's just driving you through it. Moonlight has been considered by critics and scholars alike to be an extremely contemplative film, a meditative film, if you will, a poetic film, to borrow Žižek's language here. And what he says on the top of 5 is that what distinguishes poetry is that it is always, by definition, about something that cannot be addressed directly, only alluded to in a sort of sideways or even kind of a, you can get close to approximating the description of something real, but poetry is always about that little bit of distance between the real object and what the poetic language is referring to. So just keep that in mind, that that's a really, what Žižek considers to be a very powerful and necessary way for us to think about and talk about the reality of various forms of violence. I mean, he mentions the Soviet purges, he mentions the Holocaust, etc. Bottom of page 5 onto 6. This is not a description which locates its content in a historical space and time. Interesting thought from Moonlight. There's been a lot of discussion about, well, what exactly is the time frame in which Moonlight takes place? I mean, we get a sense of the chronological distance from beginning to end of Chiron's life, but the question of when exactly did it start, is that the 80s? Is, you know, what is that? Is, I think, appropriate, because this is what Žižek is saying, is that we don't have to actually have a specific historical space and time that we have to connect poetic analyses to. Poetry in many ways can exist, or a poetic analysis can exist in a more abstract kind of conceptual space. What he talks about is an inexistent virtual space of its own, on bottom of page 5. And that this is precisely in that kind of abstract conceptual space, that's where we can do our most profound, deep thinking about a subject, and to really understand ultimately the violence that's going on underneath it. So, going on to the bottom of 6, just really quickly, his point about Starbucks, in case anybody missed that, is that there's this sort of urgency of like, okay, I want to be a humanitarian, I want to help people, so I want to buy some Starbucks coffee because I know that that's going to give money back to children in Guatemala. And his Žižek's point there is, that's the kind of fake urgency that we're taught to believe in and need to do, or is necessary for us to do. And his point is, look at the irony of that, the tragic irony. You're going to be giving money, like some small portion of your Starbucks fee, to the children of a country who is being pillaged and exploited beyond belief to make the coffee that you're buying. So in other words, you're really not ultimately solving any of the conundrum that faces a country like Guatemala when you just give a little portion of your money or proceeds to the children there, because ultimately that doesn't change the fundamental thing that you're helping that corporation profit that created the problem for those children to begin with. So just wanted to make sure that was clear. And he mentions at the top of 7 that you should always be concerned when the rich in a society actually are the ones who are calling for humanitarian action, because clearly they're not doing that to give up their own elite status. They're doing that in some ways because that distracts you and our society from really addressing the wealth inequality that created them as rich elite people to begin with. So when Bill Gates is trying to help the world, recognize that is, I mean, on some level morally better than not, but what Žižek says is it's extremely a minute kind of issue when you compare it to what was the basis and the conditions by which Bill Gates became wealthy in the first place, which is, of course, the inequalities and exploitative elements of the capitalist political economy that we live in. Moving on, and this is kind of where he leaves off, is we need to just be patient and patience a bad word. We need to be able to step away and do what he calls critical analysis. The word patient he uses on 7 is, I think, a little bit problematic, but at the very, let's put it this way, at the very bottom of 8 is, I think, where he really succinctly says it. This is what we should do today when we find ourselves bombarded with these images of violence that propel us to want to do something about them. We need to learn, and figure out what's causing that violence in the first place, get to the root causes, be radical meaning getting to the root of a problem, rather than always staying on the superficial level. Which brings us ultimately to the couple pages he mentions where he does, again, this parsing between subjective and objective violence, the Loskys and their family drama in Soviet Russia. All I really wanted to point out about that is that at the bottom of 9, he says that what you need to pay attention to with the Loskys is not so much the objective or systemic violence that is always the direct physical violence, like the police force keeping poor people from being able to in any way change or alter the nature of society. He's also talking about, as he says on 9, the subtle forms of coercion that sustain relations of domination and exploitation, including the threat of violence, not even the enactment of violence, but the threat of it. And think about that, right, with Moonlight, how often that comes up, that yes, there are these explosive moments of subjective violence on screen that are honestly, for someone like me who experienced severe forms of bullying, like extremely triggering, but those are not actually what we need to be paying attention to. We need to be paying attention to all the subtle ways that there is coercion, domination, and exploitation taking place in the much bigger context of the film than even those explosive moments. And again, going into this whole idea of we should be a little skeptical, bottom of 10, top of 11, about all this preoccupation with subjective violence, and we should really not be distracted and try as much as possible to be able to take that step back, which is at the very bottom of 11, he says really the key here, which is that we need to change the topic. We need to stop focusing on the subjective forms of violence and recognize, and I think this is really important, that all three, subjective, objective, and symbolic, are actually in a very tight integration and complex interplay with one another. And what we need to do is recognize that interplay, how each of them feeds the other, rather than being so almost unilateral or almost singularly focused on what is the most visible of the three, which is the subjective violence. So I'll leave that there as far as Žižek. The only thing I want to mention about Moonlight before I get we're going to spend most of the discussion board talking about Moonlight. I just want you to think about something one of my favorite professors taught me, which is that the very first thing you see or hear in a film and the very last thing you see or hear in a film are really important, because they are in some ways obviously the bookends of the film, but they're also always everything's intentional, but they are extremely intentional. So I want you to be thinking, just even before we get into the discussion board here in a moment, just think about what's the first thing that you hear in the beginning of Moonlight, and how does Moonlight end? And, a little bonus point here, how is that, what it is, I'm not going to give it away, but the thing you hear and what you see at the very end of the film, how are those in some ways poetically symbolizing something extremely objectively violent? If you don't find out, I'll mention it in an email after class. But I just want you to think about that as we move into our discussion board, which will open up here momentarily at 1:20. And I look forward to your comments. Bye.